A Navy veteran sat alone at his son's graduation, unnoticed, uncelebrated until a SEAL admiral stopped mid-speech, stared at his wrist, and everything changed. What happened next left an entire auditorium speechless and revealed a secret buried for over 20 years. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to see how far this story reaches. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because this story is just getting started. The stadium parking lot shimmered under the mid-morning Texas sun. It was graduation day for the Navy's newest class, and families bustled with pride men straightening their ties, women in floral dresses clutching balloons, kids tugging on collars and slipping out of stiff dress shoes. Flags waved, cameras clicked. It was a day for celebration. At the edge of it all, Henry Blake stepped out of an aging pickup that had seen better decades. Dust clung to the sides like a second skin, and the passenger door needed 2 firm shoves to close. Henry wore a pressed white shirt tucked into faded slacks and a charcoal jacket that didn't quite fit his broad shoulders anymore. A plain watch on one wrist, no fanfare, no signs, no camera. He moved with a quiet precision, a stillness that made him seem invisible in a crowd pulsing with noise and motion. When a child darted past him, Henry shifted slightly, instinctively, avoiding contact without breaking stride. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just kept walking toward the arena. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there to see his son. And he had no idea that today, the past would come roaring back to find him. Henry found a seat near the back row, far left corner of the stadium's indoor arena. It was a metal folding chair, cold beneath him, but he didn't adjust, didn't fidget. He just sat, straight-backed, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the stage. All around him, the air buzzed with anticipation, families shouting over each other to claim seats, phones held high to snap photos, children perched on shoulders for better views. Just in front of him, an older woman wore a red, white, and blue scarf dotted with Navy pins and a glittery Proud Navy grandma button. She immediately struck up a loud conversation with the woman next to her, bragging that her grandson had been top of his unit and might go SEAL next. She was proud, but there was an edge to it, pride sharpened into competition. 2 rows over, young mothers compared how often they wrote letters during boot camp. One claimed she mailed care packages every Monday, rain or shine. Another pulled out her phone to show screenshots of every FaceTime her son managed to sneak in. Henry listened quietly to it all, but he didn't speak. He had heard these conversations before, pride wrapped in comparison, support masked as one-upmanship. A girl no older than 20 slid into a seat a few chairs down from him. Her dress was tight, and her heels wobbled with every step. She scrolled on her phone, sighed dramatically, and leaned to her friend in the next row. "If I end up like that old guy," she whispered loudly, nodding toward Henry, "just sitting alone at stuff like this, just shoot me." Her friend snorted, glanced back at Henry, then turned away quickly. Sad. Henry didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just kept looking forward. The lights dimmed. A low hush fell over the crowd. On stage, 200 graduates stood at attention, rows of sharp uniforms in perfectly aligned caps. Among them, in the second row, stood Caleb Blake, 23, jaw clenched in focus, eyes scanning the crowd. When he saw his father, their eyes locked. A small nod passed between them. Henry nodded back. It was all they needed. No waves, no smiles. Their language had always been quiet. Caleb had grown up watching his father disappear for days, weeks sometimes, without warning. When Henry was home, he was loving, but distant, protective, but guarded. Caleb never questioned it. He thought it was just the way some men were, especially veterans. He never knew the truth ran far deeper than tours or deployments. A junior officer stepped up to the podium and welcomed the families. The American flag and Navy flag stood tall on either side of the stage. The color guard marched with crisp rhythm. Everyone stood for the national anthem. Henry stood, too. His posture was straighter than anyone else's. His hand didn't just rest over his heart, it pressed, firm, almost trembling, as if holding something inside. When they sat again, a wave of polite applause greeted the keynote speaker, Rear Admiral Cole Marston, late 50s, silver at his temples, chest full of ribbons that spanned decades of classified missions and public victories. He walked to the podium, calm and deliberate, with the confidence of someone who didn't need to prove anything. His voice, when he began, was low but steady. He spoke of duty, legacy, of the long line of warriors who had shaped the Navy's history and those who would carry that torch forward. It was a good speech. Well written, well delivered. But halfway through, something changed. His cadence faltered, just slightly, a breath too long between sentences, a flicker in his expression. His eyes, which had been sweeping the crowd with rehearsed poise, suddenly stopped, froze, locked in on something or someone. He stared at the back row, at Henry, at the silver chain on Henry's left wrist, which had shifted just enough to reveal a faded tattoo beneath. It was only visible for a moment, but for those who knew what to look for, it was unmistakable. A trident, crossed with numbers, coordinates, sequences that meant nothing to most people but everything to a very specific few. Admiral Marston's hand gripped the sides of the podium. His knuckles whitened, his voice trailed off. The audience stirred. A baby cried somewhere, a throat cleared. His aide stepped forward, concerned. "Sir, are you all right?" But the Admiral didn't answer. He was staring directly at Henry. And Henry knew. He didn't move, didn't flinch, but he could feel the weight of the stare, the heat of it. The bracelet slid back into place, covering the tattoo. Too late. They'd seen it. He'd been seen. The silence stretched longer than it should have. Admiral Marston, a man known for his composure under live fire, stood motionless at the podium. His jaw was tight, his eyes still fixed on the back of the room, on Henry Blake. People in the crowd began to murmur, shifting uncomfortably. A few glanced toward the back, trying to follow the Admiral's gaze, but most still didn't understand what had changed, only that something had. The energy in the room had tilted. Something invisible and heavy now lingered in the air. Henry didn't move. He kept his hands clasped over his knee, face calm, eyes on the stage. But his pulse was pounding in his ears. On stage, Admiral Marston slowly set down his speech, each movement deliberate, restrained, like a man trying not to break something fragile. Then, without a word, he stepped away from the podium. He didn't walk toward the wings, where his aide waited in confusion. He walked down the center aisle. A collective hush fell over the audience. People whispered, "Where's he going? Is this part of the ceremony? Is someone in trouble?" Even the junior officer who had introduced him looked unsure, glancing to the side for instruction, but the Admiral raised one hand without looking back. Wait. Every step he took echoed across the space. A retired Marine in the third row straightened in his seat, whispering to his wife, "That man looks like he's walking into combat." Henry's fingers twitched. He thought about leaving, about standing up and disappearing into the shadows the way he had so many times before. But something in him had settled solid and heavy, like a truth finally deciding it was done being buried. He stayed seated. Admiral Marston stopped in the very last row, turned. He stood directly in front of Henry, now towering over him in full uniform. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Henry finally lifted his eyes and met the Admiral's stare. Recognition passed between them, not the kind you get from an old friend, not even the kind you get from a former colleague. This was deeper. The Admiral's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, but in the silence, it carried, "Ghost 6? The name hung in the air, a code name, a phantom designation that hadn't been spoken aloud in nearly 20 years. People around them stiffened. A woman 2 rows down frowned and whispered to her husband, "What's Ghost 6? But to the scattered veterans in the room, the ones who had served long enough to hear rumors, To see glimpses of blacked-out files, the name hit like a thunderclap. One man in civilian clothes slowly stood. His silver hair was cropped close, and his frame still held a soldier's posture, his eyes locked on Henry with disbelief. "That's him," the man said quietly. "That's Ghost 6. I thought he died in the Caucasus." Now the audience was fully alert. Phones lowered, conversations halted, even the restless kids were quiet. Everyone sensed they were witnessing something monumental, though they didn't yet understand what. Admiral Marston took a slow breath, then did something no one expected. He raised his right hand in a formal military salute. Not a casual gesture, not a polite nod. A full, rigid, perfect salute reserved only for legends. The kind of salute offered to those who had changed the course of history and then vanished. Gasps rippled across the auditorium. Henry didn't return it. He couldn't. He was out of uniform. He hadn't worn the trident in 2 decades, but he held the Admiral's gaze with quiet steel. The Rear Admiral lowered his salute and spoke again, this time louder, voice firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're sitting in the presence of a man who officially does not exist. A man whose operations saved lives, turned tides, and were erased from every record so the rest of us could sleep at night." The crowd stirred again. Someone whispered, "Is this real?" A woman in officer's dress, sitting halfway up the aisle, stood up suddenly and pressed a hand to her chest. "I've heard stories," she murmured. "I thought they were myth." "They're not," Admiral Marston said. "Ghost 6 was part of a joint Navy-CIA task unit called Echo Seraph. Deep black ops, no paper trail, no rank, just results." He paused, then turned to Henry. "We were told you were dead." Henry's voice, when it came, was gravel and smoke. "I was supposed to be—" That was it. That one line broke whatever resistance was left in the room. A wave of emotion washed over the crowd. People began standing first in confusion, then in respect. On stage, Caleb Blake stood frozen in formation, watching his father be recognized by the most powerful man in the room, by a Navy admiral who had just paused an entire ceremony to salute a ghost. Caleb's stomach dropped. Everything he thought he knew about his father, the quiet man with the night terrors, the man who fixed engines and drank his coffee, black in silence, was shattering in real time. On the stage, Admiral Marston turned back to the crowd and said one final thing. "Class of 2025, this is what true service looks like." On stage, Caleb Blake could no longer hold his formation. His arms were stiff at his sides, feet locked, eyes trained forward like he'd been drilled to do 1,000 times. But his mind, his heart, was spinning. That was his father standing at the back of the auditorium. That was his father, the man who taught him how to tie a fishing knot, who fixed up an old lawnmower instead of buying a new one, who never missed a day of work even when he had the flu. And that same man had just been saluted by a Rear Admiral. As Ghost 6, he had never heard the name. But from the stunned silence, from the looks of awe and disbelief rippling across the room, from the way officers were whispering to each other like children who'd just learned a legend was real, he knew enough. He knew nothing about his father. Caleb's throat tightened. Everything suddenly made sense. The coldness, the distance. The way Henry never talked about his time in the Navy. The way he'd sit outside on the porch some nights long, after everyone else had gone to bed, eyes scanning the trees like he was still on a mission. The way he always sat with his back to a wall in restaurants. The nightmares. The scars. And now, Caleb knew none of it had been random. None of it had been simple. At the back of the auditorium, Henry stood still, calm as ever, as people slowly rose to their feet all around him. First the veterans, then the officers, and finally, the civilians' mothers, fathers, kids, everyone. It wasn't organized. It wasn't rehearsed. It was instinct. Respect. They didn't know what exactly he'd done. They didn't need to. They just knew he'd given more than anyone should have to give, and asked for nothing in return. Admiral Marston stepped aside, but he didn't leave. He stood near Henry, like a man standing watch. And then, something unexpected happened. A man in the fourth row, mid-60s, graying beard, stood up and said with a trembling voice, "I was in Kandahar in '01. The locals talked about a ghost who moved at night, got our intel back when we thought all was lost. They said it wasn't real, just a myth. But they were wrong, weren't they?" Henry nodded once, barely perceptible. Another woman stood, a Navy commander. "My father served in Echo Seraph. He died in a mission that was never recorded. They told my family it was a training accident. I grew up thinking he died doing something routine. Now I know better." Henry's gaze softened. For the first time that day, he spoke above a whisper. "I'm sorry for your loss." Her eyes filled with tears. She nodded. "Thank you, sir." Near the stage, a Marine Corps veteran removed his cap and pressed it to his chest. "You carried weight none of us could have survived." Caleb's vision blurred. He wanted to move, to walk off that stage, straight into the crowd and look his father in the eye, ask him the questions he never even knew he had. But he couldn't move, not yet. Discipline held him in place, but only just. On the other side of the stage, the junior officer who had opened the ceremony approached the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice shaking slightly, "the ceremony must go on. But what you've just witnessed this is the kind of legacy we're taught about in training. Only we never expect to see it." He paused. "Let us continue, but let us not forget." The crowd settled, slowly, reluctantly. But the energy had changed forever. As the program resumed, Henry quietly returned to his seat. The girl who had mocked him earlier looked away, ashamed. Her boyfriend offered Henry a bottle of water without a word. Henry accepted it with a small nod. And in that quiet exchange, something healed. For 20 years, he had lived in silence, in shadows. He had raised his son with distance, not out of neglect but out of fear. Fear that if the past ever found him, it would find Caleb, too. But now, the truth was out, and the world hadn't burned down. People understood. Caleb stood through the rest of the ceremony like a statue, but his heart had cracked wide open. The man he had admired all his life for his quiet strength, his dependability, his stubborn grit was so much more than he'd ever imagined. He wasn't just a good dad. He was a hero who had chosen anonymity over glory, who had carried unthinkable weight and never once asked to be honored for it. And for the first time in his life, Caleb Blake understood the cost of service and the depth of love that hides behind silence. The ceremony concluded with thunderous applause, but no one really remembered who gave the final remarks. All they could remember was him. "Go 6. Henry Blake didn't stand when the applause came. He didn't bask in the attention. He simply gathered himself quiet, deliberate, and moved toward the exit with the same understated presence he had carried through his entire life. But the world wouldn't let him fade so easily. By the time he reached the corridor outside, 2 senior officers were already waiting. "Sir," one of them, a commander with a chest full of service ribbons, stepped forward, hesitating. "I know this is sudden, but would you be willing to speak with some of our SEAL candidates sometime? About resilience, about the weight of silent service, about what it means to protect without recognition." Henry blinked. He looked past the man, down the long hallway lined with families and sailors, the noise of celebration echoing off the walls. For 2 decades, he had dodged that very thing: questions, attention, recognition, not out of shame, but because disappearing had been the price of peace. He started to say no. Then he saw Caleb, his son, walking toward him now in full-dress blues. People moved out of his way instinctively, as if they could sense this moment mattered more than anything else happening in that building. Caleb's face was unreadable, but his eyes were locked on Henry with a fire the older man hadn't seen before. Not defiance, not confusion. Respect. When they reached each other, neither spoke at first. Then, softly, Caleb said, You should do it. Henry frowned. Do what? Talk to them. The SEAL candidates, the officers, whoever asks, they need to hear what real service looks like. Henry stared at his son for a long beat. You don't think I've said enough? No, Caleb said, with something between a smile and a tremble in his voice. Because I never heard any of it until today. And I'm your son. The words hit Henry hard, not like an accusation, but a truth too heavy to dodge. He nodded slowly. All right, maybe one time. The commander, still standing nearby, exhaled like he'd been holding his breath. Thank you, sir. Truly. We'll coordinate with discretion. No press, just those who've earned the right to listen. Henry offered a curt nod. That's how it has to be. Behind them, a woman in uniform approached quietly. She looked to be in her late 30s, hair in a neat bun, a calm composure about her, but her eyes were searching for something. She stepped forward. Sir, Mr. Blake. He turned to her. My father was part of Echo Seraph, the unit you were in. Henry didn't respond right away. He studied her face, scanning for something familiar. She added softly, He died in Morocco, 2002. Henry's chest tightened. That mission had cost them more than just a soldier. It had nearly cost Henry his life, and his silence. What was his name, he asked. Master Chief Alan Granger? Henry closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something in him had shifted just slightly. He was a damn good operator, Henry said, reliable, smart, braver than most. Tears welled up in the woman's eyes. I grew up thinking he died in a training exercise. That's what they told us. I didn't know the truth until today. Henry took a breath. I'm sorry. You should have been told sooner. But we weren't allowed to speak. We signed away the right to be remembered. She reached into her pocket and handed him a folded photo, weathered, old, her father in uniform, holding a baby on his hip. That was me, she whispered. The last picture I have of him. Henry held the photo for a moment, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. Then, with a quiet reverence, he handed it back. I remember when he showed me that, he said, carried it in his vest, said it reminded him what he was fighting for. The woman couldn't speak. She just nodded, wiping tears with the edge of her sleeve. Henry looked down the hallway again, at all the families hugging their sons and daughters, at the banners that said honor, courage, commitment, at the life he had been denied and the one he had chosen. He turned to Caleb. I'm not sure I know how to be a public version of myself, he said. You don't have to be, Caleb replied. Just be you. That's more than enough. And maybe, for the first time, Henry believed it. They didn't go to a celebration dinner. There was no steakhouse reservation, no balloons or speeches or proud toasts over slices of pie. Instead, Henry and Caleb Blake ended up at a small roadside diner just outside the base, one of those places where the booths had cracked vinyl. The coffee was always hot, but never fresh, and the waitress knew everyone's story before they said a word. They sat in a corner booth, just the two of them, the remains of grilled cheese sandwiches and untouched fries between them. The hum of a flickering neon sign outside cast shadows on the table. Caleb broke the silence first. I always thought you didn't talk about your past because it hurt too much. Henry looked out the window for a long moment before replying. It did, but not in the way you think. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on the table. Then how? Henry inhaled slowly. Because every time I thought about those years, I thought about what I lost, what I became, and what it might do to you if I ever brought it home with me. He tapped a finger gently against the chipped ceramic mug in front of him. So I locked it away. Caleb's jaw tightened, but locking it away locked you away, too. Henry met his son's eyes and for the first time didn't look away. I know. The words were simple but heavy. They carried the weight of decades. Caleb nodded. You were there, but never present. Henry exhaled like something inside him had cracked open. Because I didn't know how to be. I knew how to breach doors, how to break a man's grip with 2 fingers, how to hold my breath in silence for 5 minutes straight. But changing a diaper, talking about feelings. He gave a dry, quiet chuckle. That wasn't in the manual. But you still raised me, Caleb said. You worked double shifts, fixed everything with duct tape and prayer. You showed up even when you didn't know how. Henry blinked slowly. And you still turned out good. Strong. Better than I deserved. There was a long pause. Then Caleb asked the question he'd been holding on to since the auditorium. Why did you stop? Stop. Serving? Why walk away from everything? From a team that clearly respected you. From missions that mattered. Henry looked down at his hands. The calluses softened with age, but the scars still visible. Because I was tired. Not physically. Soul tired. I'd seen too many men come back broken, or not come back at all. I didn't want to disappear with nothing left behind. I wanted at least one thing in my life untouched by violence. He looked up again. That thing was you. The words hit Caleb like a punch to the chest. Everything made sense now. Every boundary, every silence, every time Henry had taught him to fight his own battles but never stepped into them, he hadn't been withholding love. He'd been protecting it. Protecting him. Across the diner, Donna the waitress refilled their mugs without saying a word. She placed a small plate of apple pie between them and walked off with a knowing nod. Henry stared at the pie, then gave Caleb a sideways glance. Your mom used to love this stuff. Thought cinnamon fixed everything. Caleb blinked. You've never talked about her. She didn't sign up for the kind of life I brought home. Can't blame her for leaving. She left you, or both of us. Henry was quiet for a moment, then just me. She knew I'd take care of you. Did she know who you were? Henry shrugged. Some of it, not the classified parts, but she knew enough to be scared. Were you? Always. That silence came again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was healing. Eventually, Henry pushed the plate toward Caleb. Go ahead, you're the graduate. Caleb smirked and picked up a fork. You sure thought you were the one who got the standing ovation today. Henry smiled, really smiled for the first time all day. I think it was for both of us. They sat for a while longer, picking at the pie, letting the space between them shrink in ways it hadn't for years. The walls Henry had built so carefully, walls of silence, distance, and control were crumbling, and in their place, something new was taking shape. Understanding. Forgiveness. A second chance. Later, as they stepped into the night air, Caleb turned to him and said, Dad? Henry stopped, waited. I'm proud to be your son. Henry swallowed hard. I'm proud to be your father. And for once, nothing more needed to be said. The next morning, the world had already changed. Not because headlines were shouting Henry's name, there weren't any. There was no news story, no viral post. No camera had caught the moment Admiral Marston saluted the ghost in the back row. It had vanished into memory. Exactly the way Henry would have wanted it. But for Caleb Blake, everything had shifted. His unit was buzzing when he reported for duty. Whispers traveled faster than commands. A few officers nodded at him with subtle respect they hadn't shown before. A younger sailor passed him in the corridor and simply said, Tell your old man. Thanks. No one said what for. They didn't need to. Caleb never responded. He just nodded, quietly carrying the legacy he now understood had been passed to him long before he'd earned his uniform. Meanwhile, Henry was back in his modest apartment on the edge of town, the same walls, the same worn chair by the window, but something felt different, lighter. He didn't feel invisible anymore. He didn't feel like a ghost. His phone buzzed. A message from Caleb, just 5 words. Still proud, just wanted you to know. Henry sat back in the chair and let the warmth of it settle in his chest. He hadn't asked for recognition. He never wanted it. But being seen, really seen by his own son, that was something he never expected, something he never knew he needed. Later that week, a letter arrived in the mail, handwritten, no return address. The handwriting was shaky. Inside was a photo faded and crinkled of 5 operators in desert gear, arms slung over each other's shoulders, dust caking their uniforms, smiles thin but real. On the back, scrawled in pen, "If you're still alive, thank you. We never forgot." Echo 4. Henry stared at the photo for a long time. He remembered the mission. He remembered the man. And he remembered how Echo 4 had saved his life on a night when backup never came. The past wasn't knocking to drag him back. It was just saying, "We saw you. We remember. You mattered." That night, Henry sat at his kitchen table, pulled out a notebook, and began to write. Not for the media, not for the Navy, not even for Caleb, but for himself. Pages and pages of everything he had buried, the missions that had no names, the faces that never made it home, the split-second decisions that haunted him in the quiet hours. He wrote until the pen ran dry. Then he tucked the notebook into a drawer. For now, he wasn't done being quiet. But maybe someday, when the world was ready or when Caleb was, he would open it again. 1 month later, Henry kept his word. He returned to the base, this time at the request of Admiral Marston. No cameras, no press, just a small lecture room with 20 candidates preparing to enter the toughest special warfare pipeline in the world. He didn't wear a uniform, didn't bring notes. He walked in wearing a plain shirt, jeans, and that old silver bracelet, and when he spoke, the room didn't make a sound. He didn't give them tactics. He didn't talk about combat. He talked about what came after, about what it meant to carry something so heavy you forget how to be light again, about service in the shadows, about being willing to disappear for the sake of others, and about the cost of silence. One candidate, young, eager, not more than 22, raised his hand. "Would you do it again, sir, knowing what it would take from you?" Henry looked around the room, saw their faces, their hunger, their naivety, their strength, and finally said, "Yes. But," he added, "I'd fight harder to bring myself home this time, not just physically, but all of me." They nodded. They understood. Or maybe they didn't yet. But someday they would. As he left the room, the Admiral waited at the door. "Thank you, Henry," he said. Henry shook his hand. "I didn't do it for you," he replied. "I know," Marston smiled. "That's why it mattered." Outside, Caleb was waiting, leaning against the same truck that had carried Henry to graduation day. "Was it hard?" he asked. Henry nodded. "The hardest thing I've done. Harder than disappearing. Way harder." They stood in silence for a moment before Caleb pulled something from his pocket. A small patch, nothing fancy. Just a simple embroidered emblem, a trident, crossed by coordinates. "I had this made," Caleb said, "for me to remember where I come from." Henry stared at it. Something stirred deep in his chest. "You earned that?" he asked. "No," Caleb said quietly. "You did. I'm just carrying it forward." Henry looked at his son, really looked at him. And for the first time in 20 years, he felt whole. Not all heroes wear medals, some wear silence. Henry Blake spent decades hiding in plain sight, choosing anonymity over glory, peace over recognition. He didn't need applause. He didn't need a parade. He simply needed to protect the one thing that mattered more than his service, his son. But what this story shows us is that even the quietest lives can echo louder than the world expects. And when the truth finally comes to light, not for the world, but for the ones who matter most, it's never too late to be known. Never too late to be understood. Never too late to come home. If this story touched you, subscribe and hit the bell so you won't miss what's next. Share it with someone who needs to feel seen today. Thanks for watching, and remember, some heroes walk quietly beside us every day.